All right, so for right now, we'll wait for that to come. So, like we talked about last week, the next 4 or 5 classes are all sort of, we're going to look at things kind of the application of all that we learned before. So we'll start with looking at the existence of God. Didn't I see that come on a second ago?
It's blinking red.
It's HDMI. Can you, sometimes you have to like drag the window over. I don't know.
Well, usually I get that, but I'll get the background on the computer.
Yeah, you should get that.
Let's see what happens. If not, I will just go off the slides.
Okay.
There we go. All right, cool. All right, so that's what we're going to do this week. We're going to talk about the existence of God, and we'll talk about His nature. And hopefully, a smaller group, no one will leave here perplexed like they have before, and we can sort of unpack some of those things. So just sort of where the church stands and what we're doing to make sure we frame all of this correctly. So it's a matter of faith that you can prove the existence of God. Okay, so the church teaches that the existence of God can be known by reason alone. Okay, and so it's important for us to sort of grasp that, especially today, because there's this tendency to just relegate it to faith. But really, everything we're going to do today, except for the end when we talk a little bit about mercy, is really just applying all of the philosophical things we've learned earlier in the semester. Okay? And remember, so what's the purpose of proving the existence of God? It's meant to be like a motive of credibility or beyond, right? So you're sort of, you're setting up so that everything that you present seems reasonable to the person, so that the invasion of grace can come in. And we'll never reason to the Trinity, but we can certainly, as you'll see, reason to a lot about God. Okay? All right. So as we normally do, we'll, to avoid sort of the setting up a straw man, we'll pick on one of the new atheists, which is Richard Dawkins. And we'll pick on what he said about St. Thomas. So in one of the chapters of his book, he has a section where he tries to debunk the 5 ways of St. Thomas. And he does not a very good job. But what I want to do is, because his objections are kind of typical, we'll use his objections to sort of guide us, okay? So he says all 3 of these arguments, so he looks at the first 3 ways of St. Thomas. So when we look at the 5 ways, normally how they're broken up. So his general approach is he takes something in nature, something that he's observed through his senses, and then argues from effect back to its cause, okay? And the first 3 are typically, they're more metaphysically oriented, and they're called the Cosmological Arguments. And so he takes what he's seen in the world and then reasons back to the cause. Okay, so Richard Dawkins is talking about, when he's talking about the 3 of these arguments, he's talking about the first 3 ways, and we're not going to go through all 5 of the ways today, but and you'll see why in just a second. All 3 of these arguments rely upon the idea of a regress and invoke God to terminate it. They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. And we'll talk about why it's not an unwarranted assumption. Even if we allow the dubious luxury of arbitrarily conjuring up a terminator to an infinite regress and giving it a name simply because we need one, there's absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God: omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity, and design. All right, so what he's sort of proposing is kind of shows he doesn't really understand the arguments, and so we're gonna. So, for instance, his third argument, he looks at the third way, which is the proof from the uncaused cause, and he says nothing is caused by itself. So he summarizes the argument. He says nothing is caused by itself. Every effect has a prior cause, and again we were pushed back into regress, and this is terminated by a first cause, which we call God. So that is his sort of summary of it. So let's look at a way we can maybe summarize. All right. So remember when we talk about these St. Thomas's 5 ways, that these are logical, not just necessarily logical arguments that are trying to prove some ideas, but they're existential ideas, so that they're trying to prove the existence of God. Okay. Remember also that there's two kinds of arguments, right? There's deductive, where you reason from step to step to step to step, and you come up with a conclusion, a sure and firm conclusion, if all of your premises are true and your logic is flawless. And then there are inductive, which are probabilistic arguments, and we'll see some of those too, where you can say, well, it's probably the case that God exists, and you give reasons why that is. St. Thomas, when he's doing the 5 ways, is making deductive arguments. Okay, so he's saying he's going to take some, again, from effect to cause, and he's going to take some logical premise, and he's going to go step by step by step by step. Okay, so the first 3 all sort of fit together. Okay, and so there's this summary argument by a Thomas priest from the 1930s named Father Reginald Gargou-Lagrange. And here's what he says. He says, all these arguments can be summed up in a more general one. Okay, so he's taking the first 3 especially and making it to one. Okay, and this, I think if we learn how to do this argument, I think it can be pretty powerful. Okay, so here's what he says. He says, all 3 can be summed up in a more general one based on the principle of causality, which may be stated as follows. That which does not exist by itself can exist only by another, which is self-existent. Now, experience shows that there are beings endowed with activity, life, and intelligence which do not exist of and by themselves, since they are born and die. We'll unpack all of this in a second. Therefore, they receive their existence from another, who must be existence, life, and intelligence itself. If such were not the case, we should have to say that the greater comes from the less, the higher form of life from the lower, and that the plurality of beings comes from a primary being less perfect than all the others taken together. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what he's talking about. So last week, if you remember, we talked about how everything is made up of 2 things, right? It's made up of essence and existence. Okay, so what the thing is, the first thing is, does the thing exist? And then the second act is what it is, okay? So there's this distinction between a thing's essence and its existence, all right? And we can think of things that have an essence but don't exist, right? Like a unicorn or a dinosaur, or now a dinosaur existed at one point but doesn't exist any longer. It's quite clear there's a short in it. So the question is there anything that exists by nature? Okay, that's what we're trying to get at. Okay, so first we have to sort of decide, okay, is there a distinction between an essence and existence? So St. Thomas looks around and he says, okay, when we look at everything created, nothing is the cause of itself. Okay, well, how do we know that? How do we know that nothing is the cause of itself? All right, well, St. Thomas says how we know that is because nothing has its own active existence. It borrows existence from something else, because we've seen nothing in creation that has existed forever. Okay. All right. So he makes this distinction between essence and existence. And what he says is that, okay, so nothing has existence by its own nature. Okay. So existence has to be given to it from the outside. All right. So that's the first part of it. All right. That which does not exist by itself can exist only by another. Okay. So something has to be given existence. All right. The other part, too, for us to just kind of remember, because we've talked about some of these arguments before, is when we're talking about the idea of this sort of, Dawkins mentioned, a regress, right? We're not talking about a regress in time. We're not talking about some linear thing. So that a child exists because his parents existed, because their parents existed, because their parents existed. Okay, that's not what St. Thomas means when he talks about the regress. What he's talking about is here and now. Like, that chair exists here because it has a floor underneath it. The floor exists right here and now because it has support beams underneath it. And keep going down from here and now. Okay, so this chain. So you have this. Let's just call it a generic chain where you have A, B, C, D. Okay, and think of St. Thomas uses this example of a man holding a stick and pushing a rock with it. Okay, and the rock will continue to move as long as the man wills to move his arm to push the stick. Okay, and if the man ceases to will to do that, the rock no longer moves. Okay, so we'll take that as our. So we have this sort of causal chain, right, where we have the effect D dependent upon the stick. The rock moving depends upon the stick moving it. Depends upon the arm. Depends upon the will of the man to move it. All right. So now let's talk about why. So that's all happening at one time, right? So why then can't we have an infinite regress of that? Why couldn't we just add an infinite number of things in there and the rock still move?
There needs to be something to start it.
Yeah, because something has to start it. And not start it in the sense of like dominoes, but start it in the fact that here and now it's happening. Okay, do you understand the distinction, right? So it's not hitting dominoes and 5 seconds later these all fall. It's all at once. Okay, so that if something isn't pushing it, it'll never move. Okay, if something is not starting that chain of causality, nothing ever moves. Okay, so now think of the chain of causality as actually being existence itself. Okay, so it's no longer just the rock moving, it's the fact that the rock is there. Okay, the rock doesn't have existence by itself. So where does it get existence from? It gets it from the molecules that are forming it. Where do they get existence from? And so you can't go back infinitely until you get to a point where something has to be existence itself. Okay, and has to give it existence that doesn't depend upon, just like the man who can make a free will act of moving the rock, he can't, something has to be an uncaused cause. Okay, does that all make sense? All right, so that's the general idea then. So when we talk about this, don't make the causal chain go backwards in time, because this type of argument could work even if like the world was eternal, right? But the fact that anything exists here and now, right here, is because something is giving it existence. Something is holding it in existence. Something it has to borrow existence because it doesn't have existence by nature. All right, so does that make sense? All right, so if we go back and sort of, now we can fill in the blanks in the argument a little bit. All these arguments can be summed up in a more general one based on the principle of causality. Maybe stated as follows. That which does not exist by itself can exist only by another, which is self-existent. Okay, so what he's doing is just skipping that entire chain. All right, and so the important part is, if we go back to what Dawkins said, why can't there be an infinite regress? Because nothing would ever exist. Okay? All right, does this all make sense? All right, so that's St. Thomas's 5 ways, the first 3 ways. That's it. They're just variations on them. Okay? He gives different variations on them because he's also trying to get, this is how you know that Dawkins hasn't necessarily read the argument, he's also trying to tell us something about the attributes of God. Okay? All right. So what I want to do then, before we come back to Dawkins' argument, I want to actually look at the 5th way, because we did the 4th way one of the other times. I want to look at the 5th way too, because I think this honestly is one of the most powerful arguments today. So obviously, everything I just said really difficult to give to someone who has no metaphysical language whatsoever. Right? We've talked about the act of existence, existing in and of itself. All those things are difficult to actually talk to someone about, right? This one, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily have like the metaphysical handicap of having to have a really strong metaphysical language, even though we can kind of turn to it for help. So let's look at what St. Thomas says, and then we'll unpack it. The 5th way.
So how do we establish that things don't exist by themselves? Is it like, they can get destroyed, one meteor crashes into another,
Yeah, because
like, I die.
because something
I
that
can't will to like live forever. Is that the idea?
yeah, so something that has existence by itself would always exist, right? By nature, it wouldn't go out of existence.
But like everything's always changing. So
Yeah, everything's always changing. Nothing we ever witness or see stays forever, right? So yeah, that's in a nutshell. It's that nothing. Everything comes out of either comes in or goes out of existence. Okay. And just the fact that, like, to Sharpie's point, the fact that we can know something's essence without knowing whether it exists. We know those are two distinct things, right? So the fact that I can know all about what a unicorn is, but that doesn't tell me that it exists, right? I have to know whether a thing exists or not. And likewise, just knowing something exists, I don't know what the thing is. So I could walk in and see a horse and say, I've never seen a horse before. I know that thing exists, but I know nothing of its essence. So that distinction between existence and essence, there has to be at least one thing whose nature it is to exist. And that's the sort of line that St. Thomas is drawing. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so the fifth way is taken from the governance of the world. We see that things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. And this is evident from their acting always, or nearly always, in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. Hence it is plain that not fortuitously, but designedly, do they achieve their end. Now whatever lacks intelligence cannot move towards an end, unless it be directed by some being endowed with knowledge and intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. Therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. Okay, so let's sort of just unpack this a little bit. So, if you remember when we talked about the philosophy of science, we talked about arguments from design, right? And how arguments from design, at best, are probabilistic arguments, right? So, in other words, you say, okay, like Francis Collins is a great example, right? So he looks at he looks at DNA, he's looking at human DNA, and he's like, okay, there has to be a God. This is way too ordered, way too, okay. That's a probabilistic argument, because you could imagine some remote scenario in which those just happen to come together, all right? That's not what St. Thomas is doing here, okay? And his argument often gets kind of lumped in with like intelligent design arguments. Not that there's anything wrong with those, but they're not certain the way metaphysical proof is. So what he's looking at. Okay, so let's back it up, and so what he's really looking at is what are called the final cause. You guys remember the four causes? Okay, so the four causes were the material and the formal cause are these sort of interior causes. Remember, the four causes basically tell us what a thing is, right? So think about a little child asking a question, why, right? Why is the sky blue? And there's, in essence, four different ways you could approach that question, right? You could say, well, the sky is blue because of the atmosphere reflecting the darkness of space. Yeah, and so you can sort of answer it in all these different ways, right? And so all these different ways to answer the question why, there's four of them. Okay, so there's things that are intrinsic to the thing. The material cause is what it's made out of. The formal cause is what it is. Okay, so it's intrinsic. And then there's two that are extrinsic to it, which are the efficient cause, which is the thing that caused it to either come into existence or change in some way. And then there's the final cause, or end, for which the thing acts or the thing exists. Okay. So what St. Thomas is talking about is he's talking about the final cause. All right. And what he's talking about is we look at all of these things, and the final causes of them are very evident, right? So things act for a reason. Hang on one second. Okay. So maybe an example will help. Okay. So I have an acorn, right? An acorn is going to, if all the conditions are right, going to develop into an oak tree, right? Okay. So the acorn is what kind of cause of the oak tree?
Material?
Not exactly, right? Because it's not just a matter of the acorn, right? Because it's going to bring more matter to itself, right? So remember, so it would be extrinsic, first of all, to So it would be the efficient cause. Okay, so it's the thing that brings something into existence, brings the oak tree into existence, or changes it. Okay. So the efficient cause and the final cause are linked together. All right. So if I know that the efficient cause of the oak tree is an acorn, what's the final cause of an acorn?
God.
Well, the final cause of all things is to come back to God. But what would be the final cause of an acorn? What is the end or purpose for which an acorn exists?
Feed squirrels.
To grow a tree.
To become a tree, right? So if I know the efficient cause, of the oak tree is, if I know that, right? If I know the efficient cause is of the oak tree is the acorn, then I know the final cause of the acorn, right? The final cause of the acorn is to become an oak tree. All right, so those things go together. Does that make sense? Because that's what this sort of hinges on, is that the fact is sort of dependence between efficient and final causes. Everybody sort of good? All right. So then the acorn always acts for an end, right? Always acts for an end. Because it always turns into a oak tree, right? Does it ever turn into a banana tree? Does it ever turn into a donkey? Does it ever turn into a Lamborghini? It'd be nice, but it doesn't, right? So we can say that it acts for a very specific end. Okay. So for a thing to act towards an end implies that it has some sort of intelligence. This is where the sort of leap kind of happens. Why is that? So St. Thomas says that this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way. So the fact that it doesn't haphazardly turn into something else, right? So anytime you have means and ends, you have intelligence. Okay, why?
I mean, I think like this is kind of more of a kind of like programming thing, but it's like when a human programs, they see the happy path, but there's like so many different possibilities. And so I think that's kind of part of it. Like if things were really chaotic, I think the world would look a lot different. And so thinking that, it's just chaos creating all this beautiful, perfectly ordered stuff where the acorn turns into the tree and everything. It's just like way too...
Yeah, so that's the second part where he talks about fortuitously, which we'll talk about in a second, about the notion of chance. But why does acting towards an end require an intelligence?
Somebody has to identify that end.
Yeah, like almost to Kevin's example, where there has to be some sort of interior programming that goes towards the end. So maybe another example will be clearer. A house. Okay? What is the efficient cause of a house?
People building it.
Yeah, the builder, right? What's the final cause of the house?
To protect people.
Well, that'd be the use of it, but what about the structure itself? So remember, a cause to actually be in effect, right? That's why we talk about causes. Has to actually exist. So where does the final cause that is the house exist? Well, it either exists in the world, sitting there, or what about while it's still coming into existence? Where does it exist?
In the mind of the architect.
In the mind of the builder, right? All right, so now let's go back to, so the builder, the efficient cause is acting towards an end. Okay, and the end is very specific, right? He's acting towards the house. And in order to be a true cause, it has to exist, because the cause has to be in the effect. The final house has to be in the cause of it. Because the builder could just slap a whole bunch of stuff together when you get a house. No, there has to be some. So it's called an exemplary cause, right? When it's in the mind of the builder. Okay, let's go back to the acorn. So if the final cause of the acorn is an oak tree, where does the oak tree exist?
In the mind of God.
In the mind of God, right? It has to, right? It has to exist somewhere in order for it to come into being, right? So in order to be a cause of a true effect, it has to exist somewhere. So again, this argument then doesn't go backwards. It goes here and now. So think of the acorn just now implanting in the ground. It's acting as efficient cause, and as it's growing, it's not yet an oak tree. But where is the oak tree that's going to turn into? In the mind of God, right? And so for things to act towards an end always requires somebody to decide what that end is. Okay? Otherwise, what would happen? It would just turn into whatever, whenever, wherever, right? Okay, so why is this such so St. Thomas uses the example of an arrow shot to its mark by the archer. So you see an arrow flying through the air going towards its target. Okay, the arrow has no intelligence in and of itself, but is acting intelligently. It's intelligible. So what would you conclude? Someone shot it, right? And it's very funny. So when Dawkins tries to kind of refute this, he actually uses a great example instead. He uses a heat-seeking missile. Okay, he says, why an arrow? Why not a heat? And he's doing it mockingly, but he's like, why not a heat-seeking missile, right? So a heat-seeking missile has within itself what?
Its final cause?
Well, it has within it an intrinsic movement towards some heated substance, right? Towards another plane, right? So it's all intrinsic, right? But it has no intelligence. How does it do that?
A lot of complex algorithms?
Yes, but there was a mind behind it, right? In order for it to. So it's actually a good example, almost better than St. Thomas's example, right? Of the fact that you couldn't have a heat-seeking missile without an intelligent mind behind it. Okay? And so the important point is that there's nothing sort of coming from the outside of the acorn to make it become an oak tree, right? It's all intrinsic power. It moves it towards it, right? But ultimately, its final cause can't be in the thing. It has to come from a mind. Okay? Does that make sense?
Can you explain that again? The effect and the cause of being inside each other? Like
Yeah. So in order for some effect to come about, right? If something's going to cause it, it has to have the power to do it. So it has to have in some way the actual effect in it, right? So if I give you $20, right? That's the effect. As the cause of that, I have to have $20 in some way to give it to you, right? There's different ways that obviously I could do that, right? So I could give you $20 out of my wallet, and then I would be the real efficient cause of it, right? Or I could give you a check, or I could Venmo you, right? And then I have the money virtually, and it gives you the money virtually, right? Or I could I could somehow have a key to get in the back door of the Fed and get the $20 there, right? And then I'm exemplary, I'm above it, right? Or eminent, where I have this power to give $20 anytime I want. And I don't actually have to have the $20, but I have the power to give the $20. So there's different ways in which effects can be in their causes. And so for God, when we say like, okay, he has to be the cause of things, his are in, think of him as like the Fed, like me having access to the Fed, where I don't really have the $20, but I have the power to get you the $20. Does that make sense? So the $20 has to come somewhere, and I have to have access to it in order to be a cause of it.
So what about the acorn?
So
how does that work with the acorn?
Yeah, so the acorn has to have in it this intrinsically has to have this power to naturally become an oak tree, right? And that's its telos, or its end, that's sort of stamped into its very nature, right? And it needs other things to make it, like it needs soil, it needs water, it needs like all of those things, right? But if it didn't have the power to, if its final cause wasn't to create an oak tree, it could never create an oak tree. So that effect has to be somewhere in the acorn itself.
But it's not, so God...
Yeah, so that's because the acorn's final cause is God's idea of the oak tree, right? So or else the whole like cause and effect relationship breaks down, right? If it doesn't have in it somehow attached to it the power to bring about that effect.
So what about like the DNA unit, kind of deal, like kind of...
Yeah, so the DNA is the how, not the power, right? Think about that for a second. So that's just going back a level and explaining, that's like the blueprint of the house, right? Like, yeah, that's just how the builders actually take the exemplary idea that the builder had and act on that. So DNA is just literally it's a blueprint, right? That's what they call it, and that's why, right? But who designed the who designed the thing being written like that? Like a blueprint for a house has all this, all these specs on it, and it's written in a certain way, that an architect would write, that the builders would understand, right? But it's not you wouldn't say that the blueprint is the cause of the house, right? Just like you wouldn't say DNA is the cause of the oak tree. It's just the means by which the oak tree is achieved. So, and this goes to, and let me say this and then see if it clicks. This goes to a lot of like the scientific or scientific almost mentality of today, where you would say, well, DNA, it's just DNA, right? Because DNA can be an efficient cause of it, right? But then, what is the final cause of the DNA?
God.
Well, but whatever the plan is in God's mind, right?
Yeah.
So the way that science works is they only care about efficient causes, right? We're just trying to say, if I do X, Y happens, right? And they ignore final causes. There's nothing wrong with ignoring final causes per se. It's when you get into like using it as a philosophy like scientism, where you say final causes don't matter because science is all that matters, right? And the point is, you can't if you throw out final causes, you also throw out efficient causes, right? Because they're the flip side of the same coin, right? So if you say that an acorn is the efficient cause of an oak tree, and then try to deny that the telos, or the final cause of the acorn, is an oak tree, you've thrown it out, right? You've thrown out both the efficient and the final cause. So they're just flip side of the same coin. And the reason why they do that is because if you admit final causes, then you have to admit this is right. Did I say all of that too fast?
So how do we know the final causes are anything?
Well, if there's efficient causes, right? So why does fire? We'll use the heat from a fire. Why does the fire turn? So I want to know why water turns from liquid to gas. Okay. So my little boy comes up to me and goes, "Hey, Dad, how does water become like steam?" Okay. And so the why question, I go, okay, what are the four causes, right? Like, okay, so the efficient cause would be the fire, right? Efficient cause of the heat from the fire. Efficient cause of that reaction, okay? And science would say, good, yeah, that's true, okay? But then if I flipped it and said, okay, well, the final cause of fire, so I've moved away from the water to the fire, is to heat water so that it can be, it can become steam. They'd say, "Oh, wait a second, we can't talk about final causes because final causes imply there's an end, and end implies a mind behind it, right?" Mm-hmm. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that fire is the only cause, it's only final cause. Things can have multiple final causes, right? But one of the final causes, so fire is the only thing that can do that. Okay, let's just assume like a simple thing where we don't use electricity or something. But ultimately, fire is the only thing that do that. I can't put Jell-O underneath a pot and expect it to boil, right? Because that's not the telos of Jell-O. So you see how they're linked together, right? The final cause and the efficient cause. How one goes to the other, right? So if fire didn't have that power, it didn't have that telos or that end, it could never heat up the water.
I think I'm so confused.
All right, you want to stay with it for a minute? We can come back to it.
Sure, yeah.
So, let's say if we take the Dawkins argument to be true for a second, saying that, okay, things happen probabilistically. It's very unlikely, but somehow things lined up and it acted. Then they tell that evolution is a blind cause. It's a blind force. Then in that case, if we take his argument as given, then the blind force doesn't need to have a purpose, right?
Well, so here's really what, the answer to your question is, can chance be a cause of something? Which is really what they're saying, right? Like, this blind force of just, can chance really be a cause? Right? Why can't chance be a cause of something? Go ahead.
Well, when you're talking about the seed, you said that you were talking about how it always turns into the seed. It's not random. It turns into the same thing every time. So it's not up to chance.
Yeah. So just in that one example, right? Like that's not up to chance. But what if other things were? What if we threw that out, right? Then acorns could turn into anything at any point, right? So to say then chance is somehow a cause, really, first of all, chance is, what do we call, like, what are we labeling as chance, right? Chance is really when two lines of causation come together, right? So mountains, we can use mountains as an example, right? How are mountains formed? Plate tectonics, right? Like shifting, right? So can we say that the final cause of plate tectonics is mountains? Maybe not, right? We don't know that, right? That can actually be a chance. But what St. Thomas is saying is that anytime there's an efficient cause, then that efficient cause links back to a final cause. So the fact that plate tectonics have a final cause, right? They keep the Earth cooler. I don't know what else. I'm not a scientist, and that's about all I know for plate tectonics. So even if the mountain's formed by chance, chance still implies some kind of things acting towards very specific ends, right?
But couldn't you distinguish between it like this? Let's say among all the possibilities of, evolutionary things happening, there oak tree might not have come into existence. There might be a different tree, but due to evolution, oak tree came into existence. So that is the chance. But once it came into existence, that thing can repeatedly happen.
Well, you're still in a line of causality then, right? So yeah, if you said somehow some tree, because of some some radiation and a genetic mutation or something, this tree became this way.
Yes.
Right? Maybe that particular tree being that way could be chance, although we can then say, that was because one of the final cause, the whole cause of it was a mutation in the DNA, which maybe we couldn't predict, but we could predict radiation, for example, right? So all of those things, there's a line of causality there somewhere, and they're intersecting, right?
Yeah, but what determines that causality has to have an end is what I'm concerned.
It doesn't always have to have an end. Not every line, but anytime there's an efficient cause acting in a certain way, in a predictable way, it requires a final cause that's predictable, right? And that's just science, right? Science sits upon that presumption, right? So they try to look at, they're trying to predict how big, let's say they're trying to predict how big an oak tree will grow, right? And they're looking at all these different sizes of acorns, and they're looking at different soils and all, they're running these experiments, right? They're already assuming that the final cause of the acorn is, they're not even questioning whether this will grow into an oak tree. They're questioning, what kind of oak tree will it grow into? Or how big will the oak tree be, right? So they're already assuming final causality. Right? And so the random mutation, if that's a way that there's variation in there, I would hesitate to call it random just because we don't necessarily know. There may be a way to predict it. We just may not have the tools to measure it. But even if it is, then it's not. That random thing doesn't necessarily have to be the efficient cause, right? It's only when there's a definitive efficient cause that we can say that's the efficient cause that we then turn to final causes. So we don't try to apply it to everything we see, like my mountains example. Mm-hmm. We only try to apply it to those things that we know are true efficient causes. Right? If we don't know that right now, or don't know it ever, that's okay. So even in the evolutionary approach to it, there are things we know that are predictable, right? We know that even with a variation that when two humans mate, they're not going to produce a tulip, right? Because that's not the final cause of their sexual gametes, right? So even that we know there's a final cause. Now, is there other stuff in there that mixes in that we can't measure? Sure. But it's just anytime we're going to talk about efficient causes, then there's always a final cause attached to it.
So what you're saying is anything that has efficient cause requires intelligence.
Yes.
So I mean, what I'm confused about is let's say if we are taking a computer program, and let's say if I equal to 1, if I equal to 2, if I equal to 3, we develop like 10 options, and we give it to like 10 users who could randomly pick some number, but if they pick something, this happens. So what I'm confused about is like evolution would be like what happens because of different persons' preferences, what they pick, but it need not necessarily have a final cause.
Well, what is the final cause of the person picking the random number? So flip it. Don't think of the final cause of the random number, but of the the person is the efficient cause of the random number.
Mm-hmm.
Now go look at the thing. So what is the final cause of the person in this particular act? Right, it's to pick a random number.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and so there's an intelligence behind it, even though it just they're flipping a coin or whatever they're doing. Right. But I think the other thing too, that to make sure that that we're clear about, is that what they're really talking about too is the here and now, right? So not in creation, but in preservation, right? The fact that the oak tree always, the acorn always becomes an oak tree is the here and now. How the first oak tree ever got here is that line of causality backwards, right? We're just looking at the oak tree in front of us right now, and we go, okay, here I have an acorn, here I have an oak tree. I'm going to plant this acorn. I know that the final cause is that. So to kind of throw the evolution into it kind of muddies the waters a little bit, because we're going in that line again of time rather than the here and now. And again, like, so even the random mutation thing, we could look at it and go, well, we just don't know what, it doesn't necessarily happen just randomly, right? Austin will say chance or random to something we just don't understand, right? So you have to be really, like, I work at SAS, we have a random number generator in the software, right? Like, I could actually go back and tell you exactly how your number was generated, right? So, and you would look at it and go, I have no idea how to generate that. So I think that's the other way we have to kind of be careful about it. But either way, if there's an efficient cause, there has to be a final cause attached to it, and a final cause implies intelligence. All right. All right. So why is this a good argument? Let's kind of think about why this is a presentable argument. So I'll throw this one out. So the first one is that it goes at the first principles of modern like empirical science, right? So first principles are efficient cause and final cause, right? Those are assumed. But why else would this be a good argument for God? Think about the here and now part. What kind of a God does this eliminate? If this God is acting here and now and not just creating some other time back before.
Watchmaker.
Yeah, we're done with deism, right? Like, this is showing that God is here and now, like holding things in existence, causing things to happen. Okay, and that's often the problem with intelligent design, like God in the gaps kind of arguments, is that at best you can get to deism. But here we're now moving towards a God who, not necessarily personal yet, but a God who is acting here and now all the time. Okay, which is very different from like the watchmaker argument, right? All right. So those two are sort of deductive arguments that we're going to make. Let's now talk about at least one probabilistic or inductive argument, what I think is the best one. Okay, so John Henry Newman, who just became a saint. Those metaphysical proofs of St. Thomas, we can actually say they're true or false, right? We can say, okay, your logic is good. For 800 years, nobody's busted them yet, right? So they're pretty reliable, right? If we can understand the metaphysics and can kind of find ways to discuss them, then they're good, right? But they aren't that convincing to the average person, right? I mean, we just spent, 35 minutes going over them, and you all are believers, and it would be difficult to represent to someone, right, who wasn't, right? And that's just the reality of it. But what tends to be more convincing are what's called like moral arguments. Okay, so you make an argument like the desire for justice. You say, where does this desire for justice come? You walk someone through it, and in the end, you sort of say, well, this, the only explanation for this is God. Okay, so you walk them through this kind of probabilistic argument, where they could still say, no, I don't believe that. I still think there's a small chance there's not a God, and you can say, okay, that's as far as we can go, right? But the reason why we argue that way is because they're much more accessible, right? Because they always go to sort of, they speak to our experience, right? That's like, okay, it's this way. I've experienced that, all right? And so John Henry Newman, that's what he does. He says, okay, look at your conscience, all right? And everyone knows what that's like, all right? Everyone knows, at least in theory, knows right and wrong. They might be wrong about it, but they know there's right things to do and there's wrong things to do, right? And they always know that if they don't recognize that thing, the thing that they've recognized as wrong, and they do it, they have this feeling of guilt, as if they're going to be judged. Right? He says, okay, well, where do you get that from? Where do you get this idea of being judged, right? And it's a universal experience, right? People feel guilty, okay? And so he says, okay, well, the guilt has to do with this sort of connecting principle between a judge and yourself. All right, so you don't feel. Why would you feel guilty if you're the only one that knows about it, right? And so, he said he calls it like. So he says, okay, conscience is a way to argue towards God. Okay, so here's what he says. He says, moreover, this image brought before his mental vision is the image of one who, by implicit threat and promise, commands certain things which he, the same child, coincidentally, by the same act of mind, approves, which receives the adhesion of his moral sense and judgment as right and good. And so he's saying that the person does what they judge right and good. Okay, it is the image of one who is good, inasmuch as enjoining and enforcing what is right and good, and who, in consequence, not only excites in the child hope and fear, but gratitude towards him. So what is he doing here? What he's doing is he's moving us from what he's really trying to do in this book called Essay on the Aid of a Grammar of Assent. He's trying to move from what's called a notional faith to a real faith. Notional faith is, yeah, I consent to those things that are true. I think they're true also. Okay, but real faith is when you actually, like the rubber hits the road and you actually do those things, right? You actually live your life according to whether those things are true, all right? And when does that shift happen? When you encounter God personally, right? When you encounter Him face to face, and you're like, we all have an experience like, I can almost remember where I was the first time I was praying, and I had been praying for a while, and the first time when I prayed, and it dawned on me that I actually believed I was talking to a person. Like I can remember it very vividly, where I was just like, I am really talking about, I'm not talking to the corner of the room up there, I'm not talking to a crucifix, I'm not talking to these ideas I have, I'm talking to a real person. All right, that's real faith, that's what he's trying to do. So what John Henry Newman is trying to do is move people from notional faith, which is what our first sets of arguments would be, right? Where you just get this idea of God, He exists, and you're like, okay, so what? Lots of other stuff exists too. What does that mean to me, right? And so what he wants to do is move from that to real faith, where you know you've had this encounter with the person of God. He says the best place to do that is in your conscience. Right, and that's why he's talking about at the end, where this person goes, like, what was right and good, I had this desire and this push towards it, and I had this inner judge that was telling me to do this thing, and I did it, and I have no idea really why I did it, other than this feeling of just kind of pushing me towards it, and this knowledge of this inner judge that's really not me. And he says the only thing you can do for that is gratitude, because you then realize I've had an encounter in and through myself with God, with a personal God, with this God who maybe can be seen as a harsh judge, or maybe be seen as this guiding, gentle Father. Okay, and that's what he's trying to move towards, right? And that's why this argument can be so powerful when you ask someone, why do you think interiorly things are right and wrong, and what does that tell you? Right, and it speaks to kind of human experience, all of our experiences, right?
So how do you? I mean, I guess we probably wouldn't encounter this very often, but like, what about a person of an Eastern philosophy where they kind of throw that in the back of their mind effectively?
Yeah, I mean,
and then just kind of blend it all together as oneness, and kind of.
Yeah. So at some
go
point,
that
though,
route.
it was first and foremost in their mind. Like they have to deliberately reject it and push it away. So even to talk to them about that experience, they may have said, "Oh, that's hogwash." Right? Like my problem is desire. I just desire. If I don't desire anything, there'll be no pain, no suffering. So I just don't desire, right? So the best way, I mean, they still know about conscience, right? Like they may repudiate it, may be done with it later, but they know of it. So I think that's how I would deal with it. Right, so does that make sense? And there are tons of these kind of moral arguments, right? Beauty, right? Beauty is one of those things we talked a little bit about last week, where we talked about how beauty has this kind of connection to the truth and to goodness, where we're kind of drawn towards the goodness of a thing, and then we kind of just ponder the truth of it, and when doing that, we're captured by its beauty, and how there's lots of people who have conversion experiences just from looking at, I think it's Chesterton who talks about, the greatest tragedy is when someone climbs to the top of a mountain, sees a beautiful sunset, and has no one to thank for it, right? Like, they've all, that sort of evidential power of beauty. I'm going to try to, I don't know what is causing this.
What's the final cause?
Yeah, I don't know. All right. So that's his argument from conscience. Okay.
Question.
That's sense of obligation. Yes.
So basically, I was wondering if that sense of being judged, in some cases, couldn't it be attributed to something like society tells you about how something is right?
Yeah. So look at this is like Freud with the superego, right? Where there's all these environmental factors where you've absorbed the groupthink kind of idea, where you've gone and you get this idea that those things are just taboo because the group thinks so, right? That's an explanation for the feeling, but it never really explains it away, right? So they try to explain it that way, but they still experience it, right? Which is why most of them, that was Freud's goal, right? He creates this need for himself, right? These people still have to go somewhere to get absolution. They may have to go to their therapist who says, "Oh no, what you're doing is not wrong." But they think about this and take any sort of cultural take gay marriage is a great example, right? Why do they need to constantly be told it's okay? They need everyone on board to say it's okay. Why? Because at a certain there has to be a way to quiet the conscience. All right, so you can never kill the conscience. There's a great article. His name is Jay Budziszewski. He's a professor, I think, at Baylor, and he has this article called "Revenge of Conscience," and he looks at all these little examples of where people try to just deny conscience and how it comes back even stronger. And he uses an example of a woman who has an abortion and then decides to have a second abortion because she doesn't deserve to be a mother because she killed a child the first time, and how common this is, right? So when the person tries to throw away the guilt mechanism, it's just like the person who tries to remove feelings from their fingertips so that they can touch hot things, right? And you can explain it away all you want, but it still is an experience, and everyone experiences it.
So basically, we always seek an affirmation that what we're doing is the right thing.
Yeah.
That's what you
Yeah, exactly. In a lot less words. All right. And notice too, like that habit anyway. I mean, I think this is a good point. That habit of turning what's a moral problem into a medical problem, right? So they'll say the person has some kind of neurosis or something. Like they're, this person habitually does something wrong, and then, well, they're really just neurotic. All right. All right. So I want to go at Dawkins' second thing, and I'm gonna fly through these so that we can get towards the end. All right. So he said. All right. So there's absolutely no reason to endow that terminator with any of the properties normally ascribed to God: omnipotence, omniscience, goodness, creativity, and design. Okay. So if we go to the 5 ways, right? So from those 5 ways. So from the first, right, is God as pure act, right? We could say, well, God is immutable and unchanging. Right? The second way is his first cause, right? He must be all powerful. The third way, the idea that he's a necessary being, right? And so he is all of his attributes. The fourth way. That God is one, right? Because he's absolutely unique, because there can't be more than one supreme being. Why can't there be more than one supreme being?
We have just moved the problem one step backward.
Yeah. So ultimately, the supreme being, he can't be the supreme being plus something else, right? And if 2 things are exactly alike, guess what they are? The same thing, right? Okay. And then the fifth. So when we did the fifth way, right? What does that really tell us about God? What can we infer about God based on this?
It's intelligent.
Yeah, so he's unchangeable. But what else can we think of? What Dawkins said. If God has the final cause of all things, he's the intelligence behind all things. What is he? Omniscient, right? So now, if he wants to reject the 5th way, that's fine. But there is a good reason, not absolutely. He says there's absolutely no reason, right? There's a good reason. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how we can talk about God, and then we'll kind of fly through his attributes. So there's 2 ways we can talk about God. Those letters are big. The first is the via negativa, and that just simply means you can say what God is not. Okay, so you can say God is not a body, right? He doesn't have material. Okay, you can say God can't sin. All right, or you can say God is all good, which is really just means there's no evil, right? The second way is by analogy, which we've already talked a lot about, right? So you can say, when you say something like God is good, you mean he's good like ice cream is good, or he's good like my dog is good, or like my my son is good versus an angel is good. So that idea of analogy, right? So he's something like that, but more. Okay, so it's both like and unlike, all right? And the First Vatican Council talked about that. So this idea of analogy is really important, because very often what happens is and we'll see this next week when we talk about the problem of evil, people sort of, they assume that things are not based upon analogy. They assume what's called, you're speaking univocally, meaning you mean the same exact thing. So when you say God is good, you really mean the same exact thing as ice cream is good. Yes?
So, before the fall, what kind of knowledge did man have about God?
He would have he would have natural knowledge of God, the way we do, without any error. He would have he wouldn't have the vision of God, so we wouldn't know him directly. He would have something like faith, but probably more than we have. I don't know exactly, I don't know if I could quantify his knowledge, but he probably would have more knowledge of God than we do in the state we are. But still not perfect knowledge, because perfect knowledge would mean he wouldn't fall.
But would we have?
Wouldn't perfect knowledge mean he was God?
Yeah. Well, even from a creature's perspective, yes, and we'll talk about that in a second. Yes, perfect knowledge of God is only God can have that. Yes.
So you told let's say when we reach heaven, the reason we will probably not sin is because we would see how good God is and how bad sin is, and we would detest sin, and so we wouldn't have to do that. I mean, we wouldn't like to do that because we would see sin with all the effects.
So free will, like we do that because we choose a good that isn't really a good, like it's only an apparent good, right? And when our will can finally rest when we have the good in front of us, so that we wouldn't choose anything else.
So, like, was the man before fall? I mean, did he see good like that or not?
No. So he didn't see it clearly, or else he wouldn't have chosen against it. So he still had to choose the good through what are apparent good. So in other words, he looks at the apple and goes, "I think that's good. I think it's good that I have knowledge of good and evil," and he chooses that, and it's only an apparent good, not a real good.
So in heaven, like, we would still have free will.
Yes. But so free will, remember, is an end in itself. I mean, it's not an end in itself; it's a means to choosing the good.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't mean you can choose whatever. It just means you can choose good. That nothing hampers you from choosing good. But ultimately, freedom is fixed on the good. And so when you're in the presence of the good, you wouldn't choose anything else, right? So your will can rest, going, "Oh, that's what I wanted all along."
So one of my friends asked this question, but I didn't quite have a good answer for it. So one of the reasons we say that we need free will is that we need to freely love God. And when we are in heaven, we do that because we freely love God, seeing how they affect. Why couldn't God create man like that from the outset and still give him free will? Because then there will be still free will and there will still be free love.
Yeah, I think because the choice has to come. So really, what you're asking is why does there have to be a test, right? Ultimately.
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know why. Like that's one of those questions I don't know that you could answer. But it surely has something to do with a certain aspect of love being trust, right? So when you're resting, when a child is resting in his mother's arms, he can love his mother, right? He doesn't love her fully because he doesn't have to trust her. But when she says, "Go off to school," right, and because it's good for you, well, his love grows through that act of trust. So for a human to perfectly love, there has to be an element of trust, right? So remember, love is a giving of yourself to the other person.
Mm-hmm.
And so an act of trust is a giving of yourself, right? And in the face of God, I don't know how you could make an act of trust.
So I was giving this example of like father and son, and then he asked me, like, you as a father would wish that you would test your child whether the child loves you? But my answer was like, probably not, but I was not able to.
No, so that's flipping the analogy a little bit of fatherhood, right? But you would, as a father, continue to stretch their trust, like so that they would be more willing to step out, right? So think of it in terms of trust, not love. So it's not just a flat out love. It's not like he goes and goes like, "Do you love me? Show me you love me." Like it's more of, do you know my love for you, and is it reciprocal to the point that you will entrust yourself to me, so that just by my word, you will know it's safe to cross the street, right? And there's plenty of children who would go, "I can't cross the street. I can't do it," right? And then their dad carries them across one time, and then the next time he holds their hand, and then the next time they go, "Well, it wasn't the fact that he was carrying me that made it safe. It's that he said it was safe." And so the third time they cross, right? And so they've entrusted themselves to their father. So I think it's not a test of love per se, but it's a test of whether you're going to trust God. That's why John Paul II says, like, the fall ultimately is a rejection of God's fatherhood, right? Because ultimately, what are Adam and Eve not doing? Trusting God, right? That he said, "You're fine. You have everything you need." Right? And they're like, "Nah," because it's the first thing the devil does, like, "Did he really tell you that? Did he?" I think he's holding out on you, right? So I think that's the test, not of like, "Do you love me?" It's more of, "Do you trust me?" Because it can only be a total gift of yourself over to me, in which you'll be happy. Does that help?
And when we are in heaven, you are saying that we will have that trust.
Well, our love will have been strengthened because of our acts of trust, right?
I think what you're implying is that love would essentially be all that remains because we wouldn't need trust because,
Yeah, because now you're
we're locked in.
Yeah, now you're in the place where
It's
you're like
certain.
resting in his arms, right?
Yeah.
But your love is grand because now you can go, oh, not only is this a safe place, but I can trust that he, like, all along I've trusted him and my love has grown. All right, so analogy is the way. I'm going to start flying through some of these. These are just definitions of stuff because I want to get towards the end. Simplicity just means that God has no parts to him. Okay, it's not composed of parts. Utterly simple. What do we mean when we say, like when Jesus says, "Be perfect as your Father, Heavenly Father, is perfect"? What's perfection? We talk about God having perfection. It just means he's the fullest of all being. He's the fullness of all being. All perfections are found in him. Goodness, which ought to be, if we talked last week about being in goodness and God being the source of all goodness, and being goodness itself. We've talked about this before. Omnipresence, God is everywhere. We say that what we mean by that, right? As a pure spirit, and we already talked a little bit about it, as he's the one who's holding everything in existence, right? So he's acting upon everything giving it existence. Everything that exists here now. Mutability, that just means he's unchangeable. God is eternal. And remember, eternity just simply means that God has his fullness of being all at once. Okay? It's sort of analogous to time. And then when we go into eternity, we participate in his eternity, right? So we don't just step outside of time. Remember, time is just a measure of change, right, or before and after. And since God can't change, he can't be in time. Okay? Unity of God. Yes?
Wouldn't you say some people argue that God has changed?
Yes. And
Because of like the whole like what our culture is and that like, oh, God would accept this and this nowadays, whereas
yeah, so we're going to talk in a second about God changing his mind. Yes.
I mean, a related question is like, I mean, I don't know if this qualifies as change. Like, when the people of Nineveh, like, they fasted for something, God decided to change the punishment. So how do you tie that in with that God doesn't change or something?
Okay. All right. Which is sort of you're almost like a little bit like your question, right? So we can go ahead and talk about it, and then it'll tie into the divine knowledge. So I want to make sure we get to it. All right. So so the question is, I'm just making sure that I gave enough. All right, let's talk about God's knowledge, and then we'll talk about his will and how he can change his mind. Okay. All right. So I give these just, we don't need to go through them. So what is it that God knows? All right. So this is sort of speaks to his omniscience, right? Which is one of the, we go back to, where was it? We go back to this. Dawkins says something about if God is omniscient, he must already know how he is going to intervene to change the course of history using his omnipotence. But that means he can't change his mind about his intervention, which means he's not omnipotent. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at omniscience and omnipotence. Okay, that's where we're going, and then it'll answer your question about changing the mind. Okay. That was more for my benefit to remember what we're talking about. So, all right. So God's knowledge. All right. I think somebody already said this. What does God know?
Everything.
How?
He is everything.
Okay, so he created it all, yes. But when we say God knows everything,
He has it all within himself.
all right. So when you say that, though, it makes it seem like his knowledge is like ours, where it's chunked, right? Which would then say he's not simple. All right. So what is it that God knows? I'll even let you smuggle in a little theology. What is God's knowledge? What is the relationship between God and his word?
when he says something, it happens.
Okay. Well, what about the person of the Word?
It's Jesus Christ.
Yeah, okay. So God knows all things because he knows himself. So God knows one thing, himself. And his knowledge of himself is the second person of the Trinity, right? All right, so how is that possible? How does he know only one thing and knows everything in it? Well, if he's all good, then he knows every possible permutation of how his goodness can be manifested. That's how he knows all things. So just knowing himself, knowing goodness, he knows every possible permutation of how that goodness can be exercised. Right? This is how he knows everything. He knows everything in relation to him because he's the cause of everything. And so if I look at my power and I have the absolute knowledge of things, I can know how those powers can be exercised in every possible situation. Does that make sense? So God, in knowing himself, right? Knowing himself, knowing his attributes, all those things we said, he knows all things in himself. So he knows one thing himself, and then he knows how all of those things, everything else ties into that one thing. Right? Does that make sense? And then for certain things, he wills their existence. Right? So he knows unicorns, but he also knows ducks. And he wills ducks to be in existence. And he wills pterodactyls to be in existence for a short period of time. Okay? And other things he doesn't will to be in existence at all. All right? And that plan of those things that he will endow with existence and what is not is called providence. Okay, so how it all fits together is providence. Right? So this is how that all ties together. So knowing all things, he knows one thing, and every possible permutation. Yes?
This is way, but like, because of extinction of different animals, we can't like fully contribute to that decline in that population. Like, there's God working within that too.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can't do something without God's willing it, right?
Yes.
So yes, that would be part of it.
Yeah.
That would absolutely be part of it. All right. So that's God's knowledge, right? Does that make sense? Like that's when we say God's omniscient. That's what we mean. Like he knows all things because he knows one thing. He only needs to know one thing because all possible permutations of things exist in that one thing. All right. So think of like as you begin to know things, but like as you get further and further in your major, right? You don't have your knowledge isn't chunked anymore. You just know a couple of principles, and all things fit into that principle, right? And that's the idea. Okay, that's simpler knowledge. As you grow in knowledge, it actually gets simpler because now you can accomplish your knowledge in a single idea, or single, single couple ideas, right? Rather than it just being piecemeal, where you just have all these things that fit together. Okay. All right. So that's God's knowledge that's God's knowledge and his knowledge of himself. Yes?
So, I mean, just relating to the previous question, I mean, I don't know if what you are saying is when animals go extinct, but you can't really control it because God knows it. I don't know if it can be conflated to say, God knows that you will sin, so you can't choose to sin. I don't know.
So this is the question, like you're anticipating, like the next slide, which is sort of the question between what God knows and our free will. So God knows all things, past, present, and future. Okay, but He knows them all at once, right? And He knows all possible things. Because remember, He knows every permutation of how, let's say, just creation could work out based upon His goodness and His plan of providence, right? So when someone chooses to do something, right? So when let me think about how I want to approach this. We'll just go here. So God can will something. All right. So let's talk about the question of God changing His mind, and then this part will sort of make sense. Okay. So there's places in Scripture, right, where God changes His mind, and Dawkins kind of brings this up, right? He's talking about if He knows all things, He has all power, what if He changes His mind? So let me ask you a question. Can I will beforehand to change my mind? So let's say that let's say that somebody does. Let's say one of my kids does something wrong. Okay, not the kid that's here. And I will. In the end, my will for him is for him to go do something that he wants to do. Okay, but at first I can punish him, right? So that he will show contrition and be sorry. My will is still to let him go. Did I change my mind? Or was my will all along to do that thing, but to do it by doing it in that process? Not necessarily, I don't want to make it seem an appearance of changing my mind, but allow him to, my will is for him to change my mind. Yes?
Is this like the argument, like, why does bad things happen to people?
I mean, it can fit into that.
Like, you have to go through some sort of dip in your life.
Yeah, I mean, so is God willing good for you by letting something bad happen to you?
Yes.
Yeah, it's the thing. So did he change his mind? Did he go, you're punished, you're not punished? Or was his will all along for you not to be punished? And he just used that as the means in order to get you there. So the notion of changing, like God can will to change his mind, even though his will was still fixed at what it was going to be to begin with. Go ahead.
Well, I feel like there's an argument for mental health in that. Like God doesn't want us to suffer in mental health, but like that He's our creator and like I don't know. That whole
Yeah.
That's messy.
Right. So, but I mean, the way to always look at that, right, is, and I think this is Saint Therese is sort of the one who talks about this. Like, God, like, wills us to be like stand on our own 2 feet and be holy, and very often the only way to do that is through suffering. But He always wills it in the most gentle way, right? The way that brings about whatever His will is, right? Like, again, going back to my example, right? Like, I can make the kid just beg, right? And it may not be good for him to just absolutely get down and beg and cry and scream and kick but in my mind, I'm like, okay, it'll be good for him to think he's not going. And I'm going to let him suffer a little bit so the next time he'll remember it, right? But I'll only do it so that next time he'll remember it. Like, I won't take it the next step, right? And then so analogously, that's what God does. He's like, okay, this is the most effective means to bring about the end of this good that I want to give them. And even though it, again, it's like, think about like a surgeon, right? Like, a surgeon just doesn't go in and just like tear everything open and like root everything around just to remove your appendix, right? Like, he goes in the most gentle way, causing pain, causing suffering, but removes the appendix for your good, right? And so it's very similar with God, right? Where He chooses the most gentle way in order to bring about a good, even though it involves suffering. So there's no needless suffering. He's not sadistic in any way. Yes?
Can you explain that, like, God changing His mind in the specific example of like the Nineveh people, just to understand?
Yeah. So give me an example. Like,
So God sends this prophet there saying,
okay. All right. So which part? So all right. So Jonah. So him appearing to change his mind, and then Jonah says, "I knew you were going to do that," right?
yeah.
Right. And so, okay. So did God change His mind, or did He will to do that all along by means of getting Jonah to go do that?
But if He said to the people, "I will punish you," and God can't lie, does it mean that He meant what He said? That's my confusion.
So does it mean that Jonah meant what he said, or just
when God said to Jonah, "I will punish these people and go and tell this to people," did God really mean what He meant, or was He playing a trick to get them?
no? So I mean, I wouldn't say, like, going back to my example, that I'm playing a trick, right? Well, God, knowing all things, knows what will it take for Nineveh to repent, right? That's His will, and He's like, okay, the means I'm going to do this is to send Jonah to threaten them, right? And that's the only way I'm going to get them to repent. So it didn't change His mind because His will was fixed on them repenting. right? And even though, and this is the scriptural part of it, right? From our perspective, that looks like changing your mind, right? Like, just like from my son's perspective, it would look like I changed my mind from, punished, not punished, when all along I had the intention of not punishing him.
So I don't remember the exact scripture words, but was it like God told, if you don't change your mind, I will punish you, or was it like I will punish you? Because if you told, if you change your mind, if you don't change your ways, I will punish you, because there are things like that in the Old Testament. If you don't change your ways, I will punish you. Then whatever you told makes sense.
Yeah, I think it doesn't matter, right? Either way, right? So God can say, I will punish you, but does he mean that contingently, or does he mean that necessarily?
But because God can't lie, doesn't it mean that he will do it?
No, not necessarily. So that can be the means by which he brings it about, right? So that's the mystery of. So here I guess is a better example. Abraham, right, with Isaac. Like, why did God change his mind, right? And it was because the bigger picture, right, is God saying, I need Abraham to see that I'm not like the other gods, all these gods that require sacrifices, right? And so, why does he ask Abraham to do it? Like, he doesn't say anything like, is he lying to Abraham, or is he using that as a means to bring about Abraham's greater trust? Because he does say, he's like, you have to kill him. He doesn't. There's no two ways about it, right? And remember that the thing about, like, again, with Scripture is everything's from our perspective, right? So when the human speaks of it, right, God doesn't fully disclose everything that he's doing, right?
So you're saying, like, what's written, like, I mean, there's also that part where, like, somebody is writing what God has communicated. So there would be some nuances in there that are not.
Yeah. So, like, I think it's Saint Catherine of Genoa who talks about. She's like, Lord, like, she has all these revelations from him, and she's like, why are you so wrathful? And he's like, there's no wrath in me. It's like, that's just your perspective of it, right? So, and you see this too. You'll see this with kids, right? They'll be like, why are you so mad at me? I'm like, I'm not mad at you at all. Like, it just feels that way because you're getting in trouble, right? So it's like, Scripture is meant to be a really human experience, a really human book, right? And so this is where the Psalms are beautiful with that, right? Where they're like, you get this deep human emotion of being, like, like some of the sorrowful Psalms, right? Like, they're like, you've totally abandoned us. And this is the Word of God saying you totally abandoned us, right? And is it true that God totally abandoned them, or that He withdrew the feeling they had from it? Like, He can't, like, it's against His nature, right? He can't abandon. So there must be something else going on to explain it, right? And it's not merely that He's lying; it's that it has to change the perspective so that you can go, oh yeah, like, that makes total sense now, right?
So we have to, like, interpret, like, all of that based on what Jesus has revealed to us.
Yeah, and again, like, I think we talked about this before about when I read Scripture, like, if my interpretation somehow diminishes God's fatherhood, I haven't done it correctly. Because if I look, okay, this is a father trying to form his children, and if I come away with a conclusion that isn't like a father, which is how He revealed Himself, then I probably haven't read it correctly, right? And so I can look at, well, how does a father punish his children? How does a father, like, what is it, like, if his end goal is to unite all men to Himself, and I use that as my lens, then I begin to see things a little differently.
But what is confusing me is, let's say there's a father and a kid, and the father wishes the child to go somewhere, but initially tells him, don't go. But I mean, it seems to me like a white lie, or like there's a contradiction between the will and what is spoken, but there can't be any contradiction in God. What is in my mind and what I speak are sort of different.
Well, is it in God's mind if He wills something, right, and He tells you something different initially?
So the father says, things I want you to go, but the father can't say, don't go, because then there's a contradiction between what you think and what you say, but I understand in the grand picture that's fine, and I understand it from a father's perspective. But the problem being we are talking about God, and God can't have contradictions. That's where I'm getting confused.
So like go versus like he wants you to go, but he says don't go. I don't necessarily see that's necessarily a contradiction per se, right? If he said you are never to go and he wants you to go, well, that would be a contradiction.
I think like a good example would be.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good like
I heard somebody on the radio saying, like, this is probably a common experience, but he was like, God wanted me to go to seminary for 4 years. Like, what he was saying was, like, he was let in and then let out. But he doesn't feel like he wasted his time. Like, he felt like God wanted him to go there for 4 years, pick up that knowledge, and then do something else. And so it's not, it wasn't wrong that he was there. It wasn't a lie. It was...
I still think, like your example, I still think God can give his will to us in pieces, right? Like disclose it to us in pieces, and use different means to tell us. Like, like when God says, like, don't do something, maybe he's trying to stretch your desire for the thing. Or, I think if I could come up with I'm trying to think of a good scriptural example. I know exactly what you mean, but I'm trying to come up with a good scriptural example that will give us some of an insight.
Because if you are told, like, God revealed this thing in parts, that goes with Kevin's example of, he says, now go to this place. So, but that was not his will for me completely, but I learned something from there and moved on. So, but that is different from the contradiction example where you think one thing and say other thing.
I think like maybe the Jonah is back to that example is actually a good one, right? Like he tells Jonah, you have to go and tell him, 40 days Nineveh is going to be destroyed, right? And his will is not to destroy Nineveh, right? And then so you get into the idea that God doesn't totally disclose what he's saying, right? So he could tell you, don't do this thing, but he doesn't tell you totally why not or how long, or so there's always an incompleteness to it, I think.
Yeah, but can God tell you not to do this thing and later tell you
no,
to do this thing?
No, because that would like if he's saying like if you mean in the sense of don't do this thing, like it's wrong kind of thing, like no. But could he really mean don't do this thing
for like 10 months?
Yeah. And he doesn't give you a time frame. He just says don't do it.
Yeah.
Yes. But no, God can't, in that sense, yes, it's a contradiction, right? Like he can't say, go, I don't know, go take 7 wives or something. Like he just, no, because he can't will evil, right? All right. Let me see what I got here. Hold on, Nicole. I'll get back to the slide and I'll tell you which number it is. It's 6:05, so I just don't want to. All right, so this is 25 where I'm at now. Okay. So does God love us all equally?
No.
No.
You guys have probably been around long enough. So everybody says no?
Yeah.
Okay, how would you explain that then?
He has to love Mary more because she was more perfect than us.
See, Shardy's been here for this before. So Shardy cuts to the chase. So anytime you get in this conversation with someone, they're always like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, does God love Mary more than you? And they're like, wait a second. No, probably not.
I think it's almost like, it seems like God is just. So, like, as much love of his as you're willing to drink in, he'll give it to you.
Yeah, see, this is where the connection that we haven't made at that point.
He will.
We've now put some philosophical.
And like Mary wants you to be, even though she knows you can't be like her, she wants you to be like her.
So where I want to go with this, Kevin has sort of nailed it a little bit and stolen some of the thunder, but the idea that God is love, okay, which means that he loves all things equally. Okay, he can't not love something. Okay, and he can't not love it all the same. From God's perspective. From the perspective of a creature, though, it depends upon our disposition to drink it in. Okay, so what Kevin was saying. All right. So when we say that God loves us all equally, on the one hand, it's true because he loves all things equally, right? By how much goodness they have in them, right? But on the other hand, there's the question of the vessel or the manner in which they can receive God's love, right? So think about, see you guys. So think about God takes someone, let's use Hitler and St. Maximilian Kolbe as our examples, okay? Who does God love more?
I mean, we don't know the answer to that question.
Do we or don't we?
He was Maximilian Kolbe.
So he loves them both equally, but they're not in any way equally disposed to his love, right? So this is how we could say something like, so a sinner receives God's love as mercy, right? So a repentant sinner, right? Whereas somebody who's not receives God's love in a different way, right? So God has his loves all things, but the manner in which somebody can receive the love affects how much they're actually loved. Okay. All right. Does that make sense?
So we are drawing a distinction between like how much God loves versus like how much that receiver can experience that love.
Yeah, or even receive it, right? Not even.
Receive
yeah,
it.
I think receive it is maybe even because it's not generic in any way, right? Like that's what makes it a personal love, right? Is that his love hits you where you need it most.
So from this perspective of God, then there's only one answer, right? God loves everybody equally, but depending upon where you are, or I don't know, yeah, depending upon where you are, like you would be perceiving it differently.
Yeah, and based upon the number of perfections you have, right? Because you're
Yeah.
like God loves all things just like He knows all things because He loves Himself, right? And so He loves all the perfections that are in creatures because He loves Himself. He loves His own goodness, and so that's why He loves saints more than He loves sinners, is because they are more like Him. Okay, does that make sense?
So He does not love everybody equally.
Not in that. So that's the distinction you have to make. So the love is offered equally,
Love is offered equally.
but received differently.
But then what about the point about the perfection that you said?
Yeah. So that's only because they're more lovable, right?
No, it's like different jars of different size, and let's say you pour water into everything. The jars can only receive in accordance to its.
So I can love all I can love all the jars, right? And I can love them all equally.
Yeah.
But more of my love goes into some of them than others.
Oh, that way.
But then isn't God the one who created that perfections, like imparted that perfections into you? So what can you do about it?
Nothing. But if you're full, why do you care? Right? So that's the point. Like that's because the reason why this is important, right, is because people don't like the idea of like a hierarchy in heaven.
Yeah.
But if you're full, why does it matter? Like, why does it matter how much food the person beside you on your at dinner has on their plate? If you're full, does it matter that they served more to that person if you're full?
The other question is, so how is that different from us humans loving somebody who's more perfect more than loving somebody who's imperfect?
Assuming like you know that if you can actually assuming you know the people well enough.
I mean, it's easier to love somebody who is maybe more good than the other person, but then
you should will it. Let's just assume there's like no like familial obligations with it. Like it's not your parents versus your child, but just to say it's two people you know, right?
Yeah.
And are you going to love the person who's a better person more than the person who's not? Is that what you're kind of asking?
Yeah, it's easier.
Yeah, well, you will love the person who's more lovable more fully.
Yeah.
Because the person that is not as lovable, you will they're good, which is love.
Mm.
But this other person who you're just kind of drawn to, right? You'll love more because your affections will get into it, right? So it's analogous to God. You'll be like, yeah, not only do I will they're good, but I really like being around them. Like I really like loving them. And so it's analogous to that. So in a certain respect, I mean, we don't love people all equal, even when we don't have obligations towards them. I mean, you just see friends you're closer to.
But it's not necessarily a selfish thing, is what you're saying.
No. I mean, if someone is more lovable, in a certain respect, they kind of deserve more love, right? Like, because there's more good things to love about them.
I mean, are you saying that like? I mean,
Yeah, to love someone more just because you feel like it feels better to love them, that would be a little selfish. But to love them more because there's just more goodness in them. There's nothing like because you're loving the goodness in them, right?
Those are related, I feel. Like, I mean, the two statements you said, like, when somebody has more good in them, it feels easier, nicer to love them.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, you should get pleasure out of it, right? But if you're loving for the pleasure, that's selfish, right? But if you're loving and it brings you pleasure, there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way it should be, right?
so you could love your children unequal. I'm confused. Oh my god.
Yes. And I would tell you from experience
Don't tell them.
that is true. It is true. I don't necessarily think more versus less.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm not letting anything out of the bag that doesn't already know. I mean, we've had this conversation before. That, like, there's different things you love about your children. There's different aspects of them that are more lovable versus less lovable. That doesn't make you any less of a. It actually makes it more personal, right? Like to know that I'm loved by my father personally, right? Not just generically as his son, but as his son that that is this way, like that has these like particular parts of personality and particular really aspects of goodness. Like that's way more personal than just the generic. I love you because you're my son. And I love you all. All of my sons the same.
So you're saying like I have a son. I mean, I'm just naming A, B, C, and when you love all of them, but I mean, son A has these great qualities, and I love that about him. Son B might not have those qualities, but he has other qualities, and I love him more. So that knowing the person more and knowing his perfections and imperfections help the love become more personal.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in the case of the different jars that you were saying, so basically there are different size jars, and so the amount of God's love being poured is proportional to those jar sizes, and God created people with different jar sizes too. So so that is part of like in like Saint Teresa of Lisieux like discusses that, and she tries to comprehend what's going on, and she compares like the grandeur of a lily versus like a rose, and she says like both are like one seems to be more exquisite than the other, but then both contribute to the diversity of the garden and reflects God's creativity or something like that.
Yeah, and they're both loved by the gardener too, right? Just
Yeah.
for different reasons and in different ways.
So
right?
it doesn't matter what's the degree of perfection to which God has designed you. Like you just have to like try to achieve whatever God has designed.
Yeah, so that goes back to like what we were talking about, like the idea like in God's mind,
Yeah,
He has a
plan
divine
for you.
idea of you.
Yeah, and
Right.
you try to achieve.
Yeah, and you want to achieve that because you will be most perfect, most happy, most satisfied
Yeah,
when you are filled with God, what He had in mind for you to begin with.
but you don't have to worry about like the lack of like not the lack, but the difference in perfection between you and another creation.
Yeah, you shouldn't, right? Like, in fact, you should, like, when we get to the higher levels of sanctity, we're actually glad because we're like, look at the goodness that God has put into that person, right? So you begin to love God through the other person, like, and there's no jealousy because you're like, it's all about Him.
You see it more through God's mind and eye.
Yeah, and that's charity, right? Like, charity is, like, that's why it's a theological virtue, right? It's loving as God loves.
So the hierarchy in heaven wouldn't bother you.
It shouldn't. No, I mean, and in fact, I think that's one of those things that we have to kind of work through, right? We have to have the humility to go, yeah, I'm okay with that, because it will because if that's your plan and it most manifests your goodness, and I will be happy like that.
I mean, I think it goes back to the gospel where the people show up in the morning and the noon and the night, and He pays them all the same wage, and they're kind of like they're placing their happiness in their rank with others, and He's like, you got what you wanted.
Yeah.
I gave you the daily wage. You came
Yeah.
to work to get the money, and here's the money. Like,
yeah. Without
I don't know.
what makes that particular gospel kind of poignant is the fact that there's no thought to the fact that those people who were left out all day long were suffering, right? Because they're like, I don't know if we're going to eat tonight. Like, so there's this idea of like, oh, they really got the better end of the deal, right? Coming late. They only had to work for a few minutes. but never really sort of understanding like the angst of going, we've been here all day, I'm not sure what to eat today. And so that idea of like, they should be happy, like, that they got their wage, even though they came late, right?
So the person with more perfection need not necessarily enjoy more happiness than a person with, like, each person would enjoy.
Yeah, if you could quantify it, no, like, not in that sense, right? Because your ability to experience happiness will be filled.
Yeah.
Even though some people may have
A different ability.
Yeah.
But should the hierarchy in heaven be used as an argument? I know I have heard it sometimes saying that, I mean, you have to work more towards this thing because you won't reach a higher hierarchy in heaven. No, yes.
Yeah, I mean that's a valid argument in the sense of it's meant to push you to achieve the perfections God has in mind to give you, right?
I guess you don't necessarily know what's the level of perfection to which God's calling you.
Yeah, you just keep like Jesus says, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And what he means by that is strive for all of the perfections that God wants to give you, even though you may not know what they are specifically.
Let's say, I mean, God has designed this level of perfection for me, and I have not achieved it in this life. If I go through purgatory, I mean, what I'm confused is, would my actions here determine where I reach, or is it predetermined?
Definitively.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's like the mystery of predestination, right? Like, it's both, right? So God has a plan because he's, he can't not will, his will can't not be fulfilled, but yet somehow mysteriously it depends on your free will actions here. But in the end, it all turns out how God planned it to turn out. So that's the part we can't, like, we can sit here all day long and never quite grasp that because it goes to providence, right? Like, in the end, it's whatever brings God the most glory is all that we can say.
Like it seems like there's an upper bound to where you can reach, but the lower bound is.
Yeah, I mean, it would seem like that, but then in some way it would depend. That would mean it would totally depend upon you and not on God, right?
Yeah,
so
it's not.
That's the mysterious part of it that we can't necessarily pin down and go, it fits within these confidence limits. Or,
That's what I thought.
95% confidence limit around, I fit in here. All right, other questions?